Hi hobby friends! Well, it looks like I have indeed been bitten by the Inari bug. Shortly after finishing up last time's video, I did go and order myself a knight in shining armour, and luckily for me, he showed up nice and sharpish, so here we are. And guess what? Other than this nice purple base coat, something you could do with a rattle can in 2 seconds, I didn't pick up my airbrush once on this guy. So if the old airbrush ain't your thing, stick around, there will be no surprise blasts of compressed air this week. I do want to get some volumes sketched in though, so I'm going in with Leviadon blue contrast paint and a pretty rough throwdown of some shade. We can afford to be rough because we're going to be putting so many layers over the top of this, any oopsies or stark transitions will disappear. One of the biggest things you can do to lift the quality of your minis is pay attention to your volume shading, and in this case it took all of 5 minutes to lay in the base work, so no excuses. With that super duper rough shading done, it's time to pull out the dry brush and get metallic. My main goal with these Inari folk is to keep the traditional scheme, but put my own twist on it. The twist in this case is going to be coloured metallics, and we're going to achieve that by building up this gold base over the shaded purple. Ultimately, as you know, he ends up red, and what we're doing with this underpainting is sort of hopping to either side of the red, so purple in the shadows and shiny yellow in the highlights to build the structure of our red tone. When we add our red filter over the top of this, both the purple and the gold will be drawn together into the red zone, leaving us with natural highlight and shadow colours. And let's do that now. Over those 3 layers of progressively lighter golds, you can find the paints in the description by the way, goes Baal red. I went with the full saturation intense Baal red on this one because that chromatic underpainting is going to knock some of the punch out of it and get us to a nice middling red. I do consistently underestimate the power of red pigment though. I'm happy with how he turned out, but to be honest, if I had a do-over, I might thin this red even more and work up a bit more slowly to keep some control of where the underpainting really shines through. But you know me, got to go fast, so let's move on to the next step. And that next step is more dry brushing. Those golds under the red give us a lovely subdued metallic sheen, but I do want a little more zing on my highlights, so I'm turning to this pretty shade of metallic pink from Scale Colour. Of course, you could get a similar effect by mixing a little bit of regular pink paint into silver, but I really think everyone should get these Scale Colour metallics, so if you want an excuse to splash out on some more paints, here it is. I told you to. Okay, let's do something that isn't armour now. This loincloth put me in touch with my inner Bob Ross because, ultimately, the accident of painting on some really grainy, weird blobs in this initial layer did, after some humming and hawing, turn out to be a happy one. When life gives you texture, go with it. At the same time as I tried to work out what I was going to do with the mess up front, I also laid down the base for the fur and started to think more keenly about how I was going to tie this chap in with his charge and liege, Ivrain. Or, well, to be honest, this was the plan all along, but for narrative purposes, let's imagine I was just thinking about it here. Details like tackling this shock of fur on the Vizark with the same approach as Ivrain's wild hair can really help hold together an otherwise motley crew of mini models, but we'll get back to that in just a second. I know I'm bouncing around like a madman here, but this is how I paint, going from part to part, not always completing a section, but letting the mini develop a little more organically. It works for me, helping to both keep me engaged and stay on top of how my schemes are coming together, so I can make little adjustments here and there if necessary. Okay, so it's the cloak next, as you can see, starting with a heavy layer of a dark blue, mixed from Prussian blue hue and red. We're back in colour theory land here, and the idea is to use that red to both desaturate and warm up the blue. If you've watched any of my other videos where I talk theory, you'll know that mixing colours will always put you somewhere on the vector between those two hues on the colour wheel, and since red and blue are nearly oppositional, we end up in the dark depths in the middle somewhere. We're not hanging around here though, because we have a cloak to paint, so while that layer is still wet, let's go in with some pure blue and start sketching in our midtones. One key to wet blending is to be bold, but not brash. You can afford to make much bigger leaps between your colours since you'll be blending them there on the Mini, and you have to work with a degree of confidence since everything needs to happen quickly, but the actual work with the brush needs to be on the delicate side to avoid overworking or lifting up your paint. And good paints help too. Lots of pigment and longer drying times really make a difference. More reason to love my Liquitex Acrylic Gouache. This next colour on the cloak is Turquoise. Not only are we once again drawing the Vizark scheme towards Yvraine's, but the contrast between the warmish blue shadows and the greenish turquoise highlights gives the cloak a really distinctive look, I think. Time to finish up that fur too, using exactly the same petrol blue and titanium white I used on Yvraine's hair. Super simple overbrushing and layering up here, getting more refined as we go and getting us ready at last to enter that exciting part of the process where we go mad looking for tiny gems. What gives me strength to base coat and do 2 layers of metallic highlights on every gem casing? Well, it's thinking of all my lovely and wonderful patrons, of course, who you can see here gliding majestically across your screen. If you'd like to support the channel like these fabulous folk do, you can find a link down below, or just tap that like and sub button and help other keen painters like yourself find this video. Time to do the gemmy bits of the gems now, tackling them in the same way as Yvraine's by mixing up a chromatic black from turquoise and red, then slowly adding more turquoise and then white to build to a bright turquoise in the bottom corner. A little dot of pure white in the top finishes the effect. I like my gems dark and moody, but of course you can start from a brighter base if you want a more heavy metal look. Alright, there's still some fiddly touch-ups, edge highlights, and 1 or 2 details to tackle, but that was more or less it. So, let's take a look at the finished product. There you go, 1x knight in shining armour, infinitely more chivalrous than anything the Imperium has to offer if you ask me, at least in the proper Arthurian fashion anyway. Game of Thrones Jorah Mormont, eat your heart out. My fancy new spinny video setup means we can really see how the light plays on those metallics. He's not a competition piece by any stretch, but for maybe 5 hours maximum of painting time, I think he makes a nice character piece for a tabletop army. And what do you think? You know where to leave your thoughts, and make sure you check out the links and paint lists in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.